Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe. And we are truly happy that you have joined us today for another detailed and beginner-friendly English learning podcast, because this channel is created especially for people who want to improve their English listening skills step by step, while also learning about important global events explained calmly and clearly. And in today's episode, Julia and I will discuss a topic that has quietly returned to international headlines, which is the recent talks between the United States and Iran that are taking place in Oman. And together we will explore whether these discussions represent a serious effort toward diplomacy, or whether they reflect ongoing tension that continues beneath the surface, all explained in simple, formal English, so that learners can focus on both understanding the language and understanding the global context without feeling confused or overwhelmed.
Thank you, Adam. And hello to everyone listening from different countries and cultures around the world. And I would like to reassure our listeners from the very beginning that today's topic is presented in a completely educational and neutral way, because our purpose is not to support, criticize, or predict actions by any government, but instead to explain why these US-Iran talks in Oman matter internationally, and how such diplomatic discussions are usually reported and analysed in global English media. And as we move forward, you will hear many useful expressions such as diplomatic talks, indirect communication, regional stability, mediation, and international relations, which are commonly used in news reports, documentaries, and academic discussions.
Before we go any further, let us pause for a moment and ask an important and thought-provoking question. And that question is whether dialogue between long-standing rivals can truly reduce tension over time, or whether talks sometimes simply manage disagreement rather than resolve it completely. And this question matters today because when countries like the United States and Iran communicate through diplomatic channels, even quietly and indirectly, the effects of those conversations can influence regional stability, global markets, and international cooperation far beyond the meeting rooms where those talks actually happen.
Many English learners may hear about US-Iran relations and immediately feel uncertain or even anxious because the topic often appears in dramatic headlines or short news clips that focus on conflict rather than explanation. But here on the English Globe, we believe that understanding begins with calm language, balanced information, and clear structure. And that is why we will slow the topic down, explain ideas carefully, and help you see how complex international issues can be discussed in a peaceful and professional way using English that is accessible and learner-friendly.
The reason these talks in Oman are receiving attention is not because of loud announcements or public speeches, but because diplomacy often works quietly, through indirect communication and trusted mediators. And Oman has played this role in the past by providing a neutral space where difficult conversations can take place without pressure from media attention, and by understanding why such locations are chosen and how diplomatic dialogue functions. English learners can gain valuable insight into how international relations operate beyond headlines and social media reactions.
Some listeners may wonder why discussions held far away in the Middle East should matter to people living in other parts of the world. And the answer is that international relations are deeply interconnected, meaning that dialogue or tension between major countries can affect energy markets, regional security, political alliances, and even the tone of global cooperation. And because English is the primary language used to explain these developments internationally, learning how such topics are discussed helps you become more confident when listening to news, podcasts, and expert interviews in English.
Throughout this episode, Julia and I will guide you step by step through the background of US-Iran relations, the role of Oman as a mediator, and the broader meaning of diplomatic talks. And we will do so without assigning blame or making predictions, because our goal is educational understanding rather than political persuasion, and by listening closely, you will also practice understanding long sentences, formal vocabulary, and careful explanations that are commonly used in international reporting and academic discussion.
As you listen, we encourage you to focus not only on what is being said, but also on how it is being said, because you will notice how we use cautious language such as may, might, and could to describe uncertainty, and how we connect ideas using phrases like as a result, in this context, and at the same time, which are very important tools for discussing sensitive global issues in English without sounding emotional or extreme.
It is also important to clearly state, especially for our new listeners, that this podcast is created purely for educational purposes and English language learning, and the information shared here is intended to help listeners understand global topics in a neutral and respectful way, rather than to influence opinions or promote any political position. And this approach allows English learners from all backgrounds to feel comfortable focusing on language development and listening practice.
Dear listeners, please remember that you do not need to understand every word immediately, because progress in language learning comes from exposure, patience, and repetition. And we will explain ideas using different wording and examples so that your understanding grows naturally over time. And this long-form listening style helps train your brain to stay focused, recognize patterns, and follow complex topics, which is exactly the skill needed to understand real English podcasts, news programs, and international discussions.
Before we continue, we would like to gently remind you that if you find the English Globe helpful for improving your listening skills and understanding global topics, you can support our work by liking this episode and subscribing to the channel, because your support allows us to continue producing calm, respectful, and YouTube policy-safe educational content designed especially for English learners around the world.
Yes, and we would also love to hear from you, so please feel free to share in the comments where you are listening from today and why you are learning English, whether it is for study, work, travel, or personal interest. Because your participation helps create a global learning community where people can grow together through language and shared understanding.
So now, with curiosity, patience, and an open mind, let us begin our exploration of the U.S.-Iran talks in Oman, why they are important for the international community, and how diplomacy and dialogue are discussed in global English media, all explained carefully and step by step to help you learn not only about the world, but also about the language used to describe it. To understand why the United States and Iran often approach each other with caution today, it is helpful to calmly look back at their shared history, because several decades ago their relationship was not defined by tension, but by cooperation in areas such as economics, regional security, and diplomatic engagement. And during that period, Iran was seen by Washington as an important partner in a strategically significant region, which shows English learners that international relationships can change greatly over time, depending on internal political developments, leadership priorities, and broader global conditions rather than a single event or permanent hostility.
I agree with that explanation, Adam, and I think it is especially important for English learners to understand that countries do not remain friends or rivals forever, because political relationships are shaped by history, trust, and communication. And when those elements change slowly over time, the tone of cooperation can also change, which helps listeners understand that today's cautious relationship between the United States and Iran developed gradually and did not appear suddenly or without context.
One major turning point that is often mentioned by historians came when Iran experienced significant internal political change, which altered how the country defined its identity, priorities, and relationship with Western powers. And as a result of these changes, the United States and Iran began to see each other less as partners and more as countries with different worldviews, which made communication more difficult and created a situation where dialogue became limited and often indirect rather than open and continuous.
Yes, and when we explain this in simple English, we can say that when a country changes how it sees itself and its role in the world, it often also changes how it communicates with others, and this can lead to misunderstanding and distance, especially when both sides stop having regular conversations. Because without frequent communication, it becomes harder to clarify intentions, reduce fear, or build confidence in future cooperation.
Over the following years, this distance was reinforced by disagreements related to regional security, international rules, and long-term strategic goals. And while these disagreements were complex, the most important point for learners to understand is that both sides became increasingly cautious, choosing careful language and limited contact, which slowly created an environment where mistrust grew, not necessarily from emotional hostility, but from uncertainty and lack of consistent dialogue.
I think that point is very helpful for listeners because it shows that mistrust in international relations is often quiet and slow rather than loud and dramatic, and when countries are unsure about each other's intentions, they tend to protect their own interests first, which can make cooperation feel risky even when both sides publicly say they prefer stability and peaceful solutions.
Another important part of this history involves periods when diplomatic agreements briefly improved communication, followed by moments when those agreements were questioned, adjusted, or replaced by new approaches. And these cycles of progress and disappointment made long-term trust difficult to maintain, because each side became unsure whether cooperation would continue or change again in the future.
Exactly. And for English learners, this is a good example of how words like uncertainty, caution, and hesitation are often used in international news. Because when agreements do not last or are frequently debated, countries become more careful with their commitments. And this careful behavior explains why even small diplomatic meetings today are analyzed closely by journalists and experts.
Because direct communication became limited over time, both countries increasingly relied on intermediaries and neutral states to exchange messages, which is why locations like Oman are significant, as they provide a calm and trusted environment where dialogue can happen quietly, without pressure from public expectations or dramatic media attention.
I agree, and I think this helps learners understand that diplomacy is not always about public speeches or official ceremonies, but often about quiet conversations that take place away from cameras. And these conversations may not solve every issue immediately, but they can reduce misunderstanding and keep communication channels open.
When we put all of this together, we can say that the background of U.S.-Iran relations is shaped by historical cooperation, major political change, long periods of limited communication, and repeated efforts to manage differences carefully. And this background explains why present-day talks are approached slowly and cautiously, rather than with quick expectations.
And for our listeners, the most important lesson is not choosing sides or forming strong opinions, but learning how such complex relationships are explained in calm, structured English. Because this allows you to understand global news with confidence, patience, and a balanced mindset as we move forward into the next part of the discussion.
When we hear that the United States and Iran are holding talks, it is very important to clearly understand what these discussions are actually meant to achieve. Because in diplomacy, the word talks does not automatically mean an agreement, a breakthrough, or a dramatic change, but instead refers to a structured process where representatives exchange views, explain concerns, test possible areas of cooperation, and most importantly, keep communication channels open in order to manage sensitive issues related to security, regional stability, and long-term understanding in a careful and professional way.
Adam, when you explain it like that, it sounds much calmer than how these events are often described in the news. And as an English learner, I think many listeners wonder whether these talks are meant to solve big problems immediately, or if they are simply a way to reduce misunderstanding. So could you explain in simple terms whether diplomacy is more about solving everything at once, or about managing relationships step by step over time?
That is a very good question, Julia. And the simple answer is that diplomacy is usually about managing relationships rather than fixing every issue quickly. because countries with long and complex histories often begin by discussing basic topics such as communication rules, mutual concerns, and ways to avoid misunderstandings. And only later, if trust slowly improves, do they move toward more formal negotiations that involve written commitments, clear timelines, and specific outcomes.
So if I understand correctly, what you are saying is that these talks are more like careful conversations rather than formal deals. And for English learners, it may help to imagine this process like two people who do not fully trust each other yet, but still agree to talk politely, listen carefully, and explain their positions without expecting immediate agreement or dramatic change.
Exactly. And this leads us to an important distinction in diplomatic language, which is the difference between dialogue and negotiation, because dialogue usually means open communication, where ideas and concerns are shared without pressure to decide, while negotiation refers to a more formal stage where both sides actively try to reach specific agreements, and understanding this difference helps learners interpret news reports more accurately and avoid misunderstanding the purpose of early diplomatic meetings.
That distinction is very helpful because many learners hear the word negotiation and immediately think of winners and losers. But dialogue sounds more balanced and calm. So would it be fair to say that the current talks focus more on dialogue than negotiation, meaning that the goal is understanding and stability rather than immediate decisions?
Yes, that is a fair and careful way to describe it, because at this stage the main discussion areas usually include improving communication methods, reducing uncertainty about intentions, and maintaining regional stability, all of which are foundational elements that help prevent miscalculation or misunderstanding rather than producing quick political results.
For learners listening today, it might be useful to understand that stability in diplomacy often means predictability and calm behavior rather than excitement, because when countries know how the other side communicates and responds, they are less likely to misunderstand signals, which helps maintain a more stable international environment.
Another important point is that security, in diplomatic discussions, does not always refer to physical force or confrontation, but often means creating systems of communication, mutual awareness, and clear expectations that reduce fear and uncertainty, and this broader meaning of security is frequently used in international discussions, even though it is not always explained clearly in short news reports.
I like that explanation because it shows English learners that words can have different meanings depending on context. And when security is discussed in diplomacy, it can simply mean feeling confident that problems will be discussed through conversation rather than silence, which feels much more peaceful and understandable.
It is also worth noting that these talks often focus on stability not only between two countries, but also in the wider region, because many international relationships are interconnected, and maintaining calm communication between major actors can help reduce uncertainty for neighboring countries and global partners, even if no major announcements are made publicly.
So from a learning perspective, listeners should not expect dramatic news from every diplomatic meeting, but instead try to understand that progress in diplomacy is often measured by continued conversation, careful language, and mutual willingness to listen, which is a very different mindset from how entertainment news or social media discussions usually work.
When we combine all of these points, we can say that the talks are mainly about communication, stability, and understanding rather than confrontation or quick solutions, and by learning how these goals are explained in neutral and formal English, listeners can improve both their comprehension of global affairs and their ability to follow serious discussions in international media.
And for our listeners, the most important takeaway is that these talks are an example of how complex global issues are handled through calm dialogue rather than dramatic action. And by listening carefully to this kind of explanation, you are not only learning about world events, but also training your English skills to understand thoughtful, respectful, and professional conversations.
When analysts and experts examine talks between the United States and Iran, they often focus on subtle indicators rather than dramatic statements, because in diplomacy, the meaning of a conversation is rarely obvious, and experts look carefully at what is said, how it is said, who is involved, and even the choice of location, timing, and language, and by observing these details, they can form a reasoned assessment of whether the discussions are likely to reduce tension, maintain stability, or simply preserve channels of communication for future negotiation without jumping to conclusions about immediate outcomes.
I think that explanation is very helpful, Adam, because for English learners, it shows that reading or listening to international news is not just about the words we hear, but also about understanding context, tone, and patterns. And it teaches us to ask questions like, what is actually happening here? Is the conversation showing real cooperation? Or is it simply a formal way to keep talking, which encourages learners to think carefully rather than accept headlines at face value?
Experts often identify signs of cooperation in diplomacy by noting expressions of willingness to meet, repeated communication, and careful acknowledgement of the other side's concerns, because even small gestures such as agreeing to meet in a neutral location, making modest concessions in wording, or using polite and inclusive language can indicate that both parties are taking the process seriously, and this careful observation teaches English learners how to analyze formal language and understand nuance, because every choice of words and action carries meaning in international relations.
Yes, and for learners, it is useful to think of these signals like body language in a conversation with a friend or colleague, because a nod, a calm tone, or an agreement to meet again can show respect and openness, even when no major decisions are made. And this analogy helps students understand that diplomacy often relies on subtle cues rather than dramatic announcements or public statements.
At the same time, experts also look for signs of tension, which can include guarded statements, refusal to discuss certain topics, or careful avoidance of specific commitments. And recognizing these signs is important because talks do not always mean full agreement. And in fact, understanding both cooperation and tension together helps learners see that diplomacy is a balanced process where progress may be small, incremental, and sometimes invisible to casual observers, but still significant in maintaining long-term communication and stability.
I like that explanation because it shows English learners that even when conversations appear calm, there may be underlying disagreements, and noticing this difference between surface-level dialogue and deeper intentions helps students become critical listeners who can distinguish between what is actually communicated and what is implied, which is a key skill for understanding news, reports, and international discussions.
Experts also frequently use reasoning vocabulary such as indicates, suggests, implies, may, might, and could when discussing diplomatic signals, because absolute statements are rarely accurate in complex international situations, and by introducing these words to English learners, we provide tools to express uncertainty, analyze situations carefully, and describe evidence-based interpretations without sounding overly confident or speculative.
Exactly, Adam. And for learners, it is useful to notice how these words appear in sentences, because instead of saying, "This meeting means agreement," experts would say, "This meeting may indicate cooperation," which is more precise, neutral, and professional. And practicing this language helps students speak and write about sensitive topics calmly and analytically in English.
It is also important to emphasize that talks are often a combination of dialogue and testing boundaries, which means that countries may discuss shared concerns while also exploring the limits of what they are willing to accept. And understanding this concept allows learners to see that diplomatic interactions are rarely straightforward, and that observing patterns, timing, and language can help analysts and students alike draw reasonable conclusions without assuming immediate outcomes.
Yes, and for listeners, this is another example of how English can be learned while analysing global issues. Because by listening to these patterns and paraphrasing them in your own words, you not only improve comprehension, but also develop reasoning skills that help you understand formal reports, podcasts, and news commentary in a calm, thoughtful way.
Finally, when we look at how experts interpret the talks, it becomes clear that their assessments are careful, incremental, and based on multiple pieces of evidence, such as statements, gestures, and the involvement of mediators. And this approach teaches English learners that reading between the lines, thinking critically, and observing patterns over time are essential skills not only in diplomacy, but also in understanding complex English texts and discussions about any professional or global topic.
I completely agree, Adam. And for learners, it is encouraging to see that critical thinking in English does not require knowing everything perfectly, but rather involves asking questions, noticing subtle cues, comparing statements, and thinking logically about what might be happening, which strengthens both language skills and the ability to understand international affairs in a calm and informed way.
So, in summary, analyzing diplomacy versus conflict teaches listeners that international talks are rarely black and white, that small signals of cooperation and tension are both important, that experts rely on evidence and careful language, and that learning to describe uncertainty, interpret subtle actions, and use precise vocabulary in English is a key skill for understanding global news while developing reasoning and professional communication abilities.
And for our listeners, the most important lesson is to approach news and global discussions with curiosity, patience, and careful observation. Because recognizing signals, analyzing language, and connecting ideas calmly will help you understand diplomacy, build English vocabulary, and improve your confidence in following international events without being overwhelmed by complex or dramatic reporting.
When we read or hear about the US-Iran talks in Oman through different news outlets, it is very important to understand that media coverage often frames the same event in different ways, because journalists and editors make choices about which words to highlight, which images to use, and which aspects of a story to emphasize, and these choices influence how the audience perceives the situation. So for English learners, recognizing these patterns is essential because it allows you to understand that headlines and reports can sound dramatic or urgent even when the underlying event is calm and procedural. And developing this skill improves both language comprehension and critical thinking.
Yes, Adam. And for learners, it is very easy to be influenced by dramatic headlines because words like crisis, escalation, or breakthrough appear frequently. But in reality, the meetings may be quiet discussions aimed at maintaining communication rather than sudden changes. So paying attention to the actual details and reading the full article or listening to the full report helps learners avoid jumping to conclusions. And this is an important habit for anyone trying to understand international news in English.
One key point to notice is that even when multiple news outlets cover the same event, the language they use, the experts they quote, and the context they provide can vary widely, and this does not always mean one source is wrong, but rather that each outlet has its own style, focus, and audience, and English learners benefit from comparing different reports, noting which words describe actions, intentions, or uncertainty, and thinking critically about the tone, because this practice strengthens vocabulary, comprehension, and analytical skills simultaneously.
Exactly, Adam. And for learners, it can be helpful to highlight or repeat words that indicate uncertainty, such as may, might, suggests, or appears, because these words are very common in international reporting, and they allow writers to convey careful observations without making definitive claims. And by noticing these patterns, learners can also improve their ability to describe complex topics in their own words, calmly and accurately.
Another important concept is that media often chooses a focus depending on the audience. For example, a regional news outlet may highlight local implications of the US-Iran talks, while an international outlet may discuss the broader impact on global trade, energy, or diplomacy. And understanding this helps English learners recognize that every report has a perspective, and that reading multiple sources, especially neutral ones, provides a more balanced understanding of an event without relying on sensationalized language.
Yes, and I would add that learners should be cautious with headlines because they are designed to attract attention, often using strong verbs or emotional phrases that summarize a story quickly. But when you listen carefully to the full discussion or article, the reality is usually more measured and factual, and this approach trains you to think critically in English while also noticing how writers structure sentences, choose adjectives, and organize information.
Media literacy is therefore a vital skill for English learners who want to understand global events accurately, because it combines careful reading, listening, vocabulary awareness, and analysis of tone and intent. And by practicing these skills, learners can identify when a report is highlighting process, dialogue, or small gestures of cooperation rather than exaggerating conflict or risk, which is especially useful for interpreting international diplomacy calmly and professionally.
I completely agree, Adam. And one useful tip for learners is to ask themselves questions while reading or listening, such as, does the story focus on facts or speculation? Are multiple perspectives presented? And does the language signal uncertainty or definiteness? Because this active engagement helps learners notice patterns, reinforce vocabulary, and avoid being misled by overly dramatic phrasing that is common in news reporting.
It is also worth mentioning that learning to identify neutral sources is part of building both media literacy and English skills, because sources that focus on careful language, balanced reporting, and evidence-based statements allow learners to encounter complex topics in manageable language. Observe how sentences are structured in formal contexts, and recognize expressions that are widely used in diplomatic and academic English, such as, according to officials, experts suggest, or the discussions may indicate, which appear repeatedly in high-quality reporting.
Yes, and for English learners, it is important to combine vocabulary awareness with critical thinking, because this allows you to read or listen without feeling overwhelmed by unfamiliar words or dramatic phrasing, and by identifying key expressions, summarizing them in your own words, and reflecting on the tone, you can understand not only the content, but also how professional communicators structure ideas in English, which is essential for long-term improvement in listening and reading comprehension.
Finally, when we consider media narratives in the context of U.S.-Iran diplomacy, we see that understanding headlines, comparing sources, analyzing tone, and recognizing the purpose of the report are all key skills that help learners avoid confusion, reduce anxiety about international events, and build the confidence to follow complex global topics. And by applying this approach, students strengthen their vocabulary, listening comprehension, reasoning skills, and ability to summarize information accurately in English.
So, dear listeners, the main lesson from this section is that while headlines and reports may appear dramatic, careful reading, critical listening, and attention to neutral sources allow you to understand events in a calm, balanced, and professional way. And practicing these skills not only improves your comprehension of international news, but also develops the analytical thinking and language proficiency needed to follow real-world discussions in English confidently and effectively.
In conclusion, by observing how media presents the same event in different ways, paying attention to language that conveys uncertainty, and comparing multiple perspectives, English learners can learn to distinguish between sensation and substance, improve both vocabulary and comprehension, and approach global events like the U.S.-Iran talks in Oman with calm reasoning, awareness of context, and a professional, neutral understanding of the way international affairs are communicated through media.
And for our listeners, remember that every headline is only a small part of the story, and by reading or listening to the full coverage carefully, questioning the tone, and identifying key words and phrases, you can improve your English, understand international developments, and develop confidence in following news calmly and thoughtfully without being influenced by dramatic language or incomplete information.
When we examine the regional and global implications of the US-Iran talks in Oman, it is important to understand that these discussions are observed not only by the two countries directly involved, but also by neighboring states, international organizations, and global markets. Because even small signals from diplomacy can influence how countries plan their economic and political strategies, how energy supply chains are monitored, and how multilateral discussions about security and cooperation are conducted. And for English learners, seeing these connections helps to understand that global events are interconnected, and that careful, calm analysis is essential to grasp the broader context without assuming dramatic outcomes.
Yes, Adam. And for our listeners, it is useful to think of this like a classroom or workplace, where one important meeting can affect decisions in many different teams, because even if the conversation is calm and private, other people will observe, take notes, and adjust their actions slightly based on what they hear. And this analogy shows English learners that regional and global implications do not necessarily mean conflict, but rather ripple effects in planning, expectations, and cooperative efforts.
From a regional perspective, the talks can influence how countries in the Middle East coordinate on shared challenges, such as trade, energy resources, and cross-border communication. And even without dramatic statements, consistent dialogue between major actors helps build predictability, reduces misunderstanding, and supports structured decision-making for regional partnerships. And this careful approach demonstrates that diplomacy often works in slow steps rather than immediate leaps, which is a concept that English learners can apply when following long-term global stories.
Exactly, Adam. And for learners, it is helpful to understand that predictability in diplomacy does not mean controlling outcomes, but rather knowing how different countries are likely to respond and what frameworks of communication exist, which allows planners and analysts to adjust strategies, make informed decisions, and avoid surprises. And noticing these words and their use in context helps students expand vocabulary in a calm, professional register.
On a global level, even neutral markets and international partners pay attention to these talks, because stability in one region can influence supply chains, energy pricing, and trade agreements worldwide. And learning to describe these effects in English involves words like influence, impact, stability, and cooperation, which are commonly used in news, reports, and academic discussions. And by analyzing them, English learners not only improve comprehension, but also understand how a regional diplomatic dialogue can have measured indirect effects across the world without escalating tensions.
I like that explanation because it shows that learners do not need to worry about negative outcomes to understand global significance. And for English practice, connecting regional events to global effects helps students think logically, link cause and effect, and understand phrases like as a result, in response to, and due to, which appear frequently in professional news and academic reporting.
It is also important to note that these implications are often subtle and cumulative, meaning that diplomats, economists, and international organizations monitor patterns, track statements, and adjust recommendations over time rather than reacting dramatically to each meeting. And understanding this slow, observational approach helps English learners grasp the meaning of cautious language, hedging expressions like may, might, or could, and conditional statements that are essential in describing complex global processes.
Yes, Adam. And for learners, it is helpful to see that even when no major announcement is made, the continuation of dialogue itself has significance, because it signals ongoing communication, potential cooperation, and professional engagement. And by hearing and analyzing these ideas, students can practice listening to long, structured English sentences, follow logical connections, and strengthen comprehension of formal vocabulary without being distracted by sensationalized interpretations.
When we combine both regional and global perspectives, we can see that the US-Iran talks in Oman function as part of a larger system where information, communication, and coordination matter more than dramatic gestures. And this perspective allows English learners to understand the importance of context the meaning of measured statements, and the vocabulary used to describe outcomes, such as influence, effect, stability, and continuity, which are repeated frequently in professional and educational discussions.
And for our listeners, it is reassuring to know that understanding global implications does not require fear or worry, because the focus is on observing patterns, describing relationships, and analyzing measured outcomes, which are all skills that strengthen both English proficiency and global awareness. And by paying attention to structured explanations and calm vocabulary, learners can follow complex topics with confidence and clarity.
Finally, we can summarize that regional and global implications are about observing the effects of communication, maintaining stability, understanding patterns of influence, and learning to describe these ideas professionally in English. And by approaching this subject carefully, learners practice not only comprehension, but also analytical thinking, vocabulary expansion, and the ability to explain multi-step processes in clear, formal, and calm language, suitable for academic, professional, and international contexts.
Yes, and for English learners, the key takeaway is that international talks, such as the US-Iran discussions in Oman, affect regions and global systems indirectly. And understanding these effects through calm explanations, clear cause and effect language, and neutral vocabulary allows students to improve listening skills, expand English knowledge, and gain confidence in analyzing global issues without stress or confusion, which is the ultimate goal of educational podcasts like this one.
When we talk about high-level diplomacy, such as the US-Iran discussions in Oman, it is important to realize that even though ordinary people may not see these talks directly, the outcomes and patterns of communication can still have indirect effects on daily life, because decisions made in diplomacy influence energy prices, international trade, transportation, and the planning of global businesses. And for English learners, understanding this connection helps make abstract topics more concrete, showing that even calm and procedural talks between nations can ripple outward to affect jobs, prices, and economic expectations without causing fear or dramatic consequences.
Yes, Adam. And for our listeners, it may help to think about it like a neighborhood where people talk to each other to maintain harmony. Even if the conversations seem small or private, the resulting trust and understanding help everyone plan better for the week ahead, such as deciding when to buy supplies, how to budget, or whether it is safe to invest in a project. And this simple analogy helps English learners connect international diplomacy with daily experiences that are easy to relate to and understand.
Another important area where diplomacy touches ordinary lives is energy, because international relations affect the supply and pricing of oil, gas, and electricity. And while these topics are often described in technical or complex ways, at the basic level, the principle is that stable communication between countries helps prevent sudden fluctuations, maintain predictable markets, and ensure that households and businesses can rely on energy for heating, transportation, and industry. And by explaining it this way, learners can grasp global influence without feeling overwhelmed by technical details or dramatic interpretations.
Exactly, Adam. And learners can imagine this like planning a grocery budget. If the cost of essential items suddenly changes every day, it is hard to manage. But if prices are stable, families can plan ahead. And in the same way, diplomacy that reduces uncertainty contributes indirectly to stability in markets and everyday life, which is a very practical way for learners to see how international discussions matter to people around the world.
The economy is another area where ordinary people can feel the indirect impact of diplomatic talks, because trade agreements, negotiations, and communication between countries influence the cost of imported goods, the availability of products, and sometimes even job opportunities in industries connected to global markets. And understanding this process helps learners see that diplomacy is not just about abstract politics, but also about creating predictable conditions that support economic planning. And learning these words and concepts improves both vocabulary and comprehension in English.
I completely agree, Adam. And a simple example for learners is that when countries cooperate and communicate calmly, exporters can plan shipments, importers can arrange supply, and local stores can ensure that products are available for families, which shows that behind every international decision, there are small but meaningful effects on ordinary routines, and noticing this connection helps students understand global English vocabulary in a practical and relatable way.
Stability in diplomacy also indirectly affects ordinary lives by providing confidence in long-term planning for both governments and businesses. Because when countries maintain dialogue and avoid misunderstandings, people can expect more predictable policies, reliable contracts, and fewer sudden disruptions in areas like finance, transportation, and public services. And for English learners, this concept allows us to discuss cause and effect using clear, formal language while connecting abstract international events to everyday consequences.
Yes. And thinking about this in everyday life can be as simple as noting that if neighbours communicate well, school schedules, public transport, and community events run smoothly. And in the same way, steady communication between nations contributes to a predictable environment where families, businesses, and communities can make better decisions without stress, which is a reassuring way for learners to connect global news to familiar experiences.
It is also useful for learners to recognize vocabulary and phrases that explain these indirect effects, such as impact on daily life, economic stability, market predictability, energy availability, and planning for the future, because these expressions often appear in news and reports about international relations, and by hearing them used in context, students can expand their professional and academic English, while understanding that diplomacy is more about careful management than dramatic events.
And for listeners, the main takeaway is that while high-level discussions between nations may seem distant or abstract, they influence ordinary life in calm and predictable ways, from energy prices to job planning to trade availability. And by understanding these connections, learners can improve their English comprehension, notice patterns in professional communication, and feel confident discussing international topics in a way that is accurate, neutral, and relatable.
Finally, we can summarize that the indirect consequences of diplomacy help ordinary people by creating stability, predictability, and confidence in global systems, and by paying attention to these calm, structured explanations, English learners not only develop vocabulary and comprehension skills, but also gain a practical understanding of how global events, even if far away, connect to daily life in ways that are educational, non-alarmist, and reassuring.
Yes, and dear listeners, by reflecting on how these diplomatic talks indirectly affect energy, economy, and daily routines, you can see that international events are not distant or overwhelming, but rather interconnected with everyday experiences, and by following this reasoning calmly and practicing the new vocabulary, learners strengthen both language skills and global awareness, which is the ultimate goal of this educational podcast series.
Dear listeners, in this section, we will focus specifically on vocabulary that is essential for understanding diplomacy, international relations, and discussions like the US-Iran talks in Oman. Because learning the right words not only improves comprehension, but also helps you speak and write confidently about global topics. And some of the most important terms we will explore today are diplomacy, mediation, dialogue, tension, stability, communication, and cooperation, which appear repeatedly in news reports and formal discussions, and by understanding their meaning, pronunciation, and usage, English learners can follow complex stories without confusion.
Yes, Adam. And for learners, it is very helpful to hear these words used in simple real-world contexts, because vocabulary is easier to remember when you can connect it to everyday situations. So, for example, diplomacy can mean the careful way people communicate to solve problems politely, like when friends talk calmly to resolve a misunderstanding, or when countries discuss trade or security without creating conflict, and practicing this meaning and usage helps learners understand both formal and informal situations in English.
Another key word is mediation, which refers to a process where a neutral person or country helps two sides communicate and find common ground. And in international relations, Oman often acts as a mediator between the United States and Iran, meaning that it helps both sides exchange information and express concerns in a safe, controlled setting. And for English learners, using the word mediation in sentences like, "The teacher acted as a mediator between students arguing about a project," allows you to see the word applied clearly and naturally.
Exactly, Adam. And dialogue is also very important because it describes the process of exchanging ideas, opinions, or concerns in a conversation. And unlike negotiation, dialogue does not require immediate agreements. So for learners, an example could be, we had a dialogue about how to organize the event, which mirrors international examples where countries maintain ongoing conversations to understand each other. And repeating sentences like this helps learners remember the meaning and structure in English.
The word tension is another common term that appears in news about diplomacy, and it refers to a feeling of strain or concern between two parties. But in English learning, it is crucial to understand that tension does not always indicate conflict or danger. It can simply describe a situation where careful communication is needed. So, for example, "There was tension in the classroom before the exam results were announced," illustrates how the word can be applied in everyday contexts and professional discussions without fear or alarm.
Yes. And for learners, it is useful to combine vocabulary words in sentences. For instance, diplomacy and mediation are important tools to reduce tension between countries, because this shows how multiple words work together to explain relationships and processes. And practicing such sentences aloud helps students improve pronunciation, fluency, and understanding while connecting vocabulary to the broader topic of global news in a calm, educational way.
Another word that frequently appears in these discussions is stability, which means a predictable and balanced condition where people or systems can function effectively. And in diplomacy, stability often refers to political, economic, or regional predictability. And for learners, using a sentence like, "The new plan brought stability to the neighborhood after months of uncertainty," helps translate complex global concepts into relatable English usage, showing how formal vocabulary can be applied to simple, everyday examples.
And communication is equally important because it represents the act of exchanging information clearly and effectively, which is central to dialogue, diplomacy, and mediation. So a learner-friendly sentence could be, "Good communication between teammates helps prevent mistakes." And by repeating this word and sentence structure, learners can connect it to both personal experiences and international contexts, reinforcing comprehension and active usage of English in professional topics.
Finally, cooperation is a key term for understanding how countries, organizations, and individuals work together toward shared goals. And in the context of the US-Iran talks, cooperation might mean agreeing on methods to exchange information, plan meetings, or maintain stability, and learners can practice the word with sentences like, "Teamwork requires cooperation from everyone," which highlights the meaning, usage, and pronunciation, while keeping the sentence clear, slow, and learner-friendly.
Yes, Adam, and for our listeners, the most effective way to remember and use these words is through repetition and practice, by listening carefully, repeating sentences aloud, and creating your own examples using the words in familiar contexts, because this method builds both vocabulary and confidence in English. And by connecting these terms to real-world diplomacy, learners strengthen their ability to discuss global topics calmly, accurately, and professionally.
To summarize, in this vocabulary-focused section, we explored essential words like diplomacy, mediation, dialogue, tension, stability, communication, and cooperation, explained their meaning, provided simple sentences, and showed how learners can apply them to both daily life and international news. And by practicing these words, English learners not only improve comprehension, but also develop the ability to understand and describe global events in formal, neutral, and educational English.
And dear listeners, remember that practicing vocabulary slowly and repeatedly, using example sentences, and connecting new words to both everyday situations and international contexts is the key to building strong English skills. And by following this approach, you can understand news, podcasts, and discussions about global diplomacy confidently, calmly, and accurately, which is exactly the goal of the English Globe's educational podcast series.
As we reach the conclusion of today's educational podcast, it is important to summarize carefully all the major points we have discussed regarding the U.S.-Iran talks in Oman, because our goal throughout this episode has been to provide structured, clear, and calm explanations that help English learners understand both the global context and the vocabulary. So we began by exploring the historical background of U.S.-Iran relations, noting key events that shaped communication patterns. Then we examined why Oman serves as a neutral mediator, and how diplomacy, dialogue, and measured communication play a crucial role in maintaining stability without escalating tensions.
Yes, Adam. And for learners, it is very helpful to hear a summary because repetition strengthens understanding. And as you listen, remember that all discussions were explained in slow, clear English to help you follow complex topics step by step. And we emphasize that words such as diplomacy, mediation, dialogue, tension, stability, cooperation, and communication are not just technical vocabulary, but practical tools that you can use to describe global events, personal interactions, and professional situations. So practicing these words repeatedly helps you grow confidence in both comprehension and speaking.
We also discussed how media narratives and public perception influence the way ordinary people interpret international events, and we highlighted that headlines can sometimes sound dramatic even when the underlying discussions are calm and procedural. And for English learners, noticing patterns in language, comparing sources, and analyzing tone are key skills for media literacy, because they allow you to distinguish between sensational language and factual reporting, and to describe cause and effect relationships using professional, neutral vocabulary that is widely applicable in global news, academic discussions, and formal English contexts.
Exactly, Adam. And we explored regional and global implications, showing that even when you are not directly involved in diplomatic discussions, stable communication between countries influences energy markets, economic planning, trade, and international cooperation in ways that touch ordinary lives indirectly. And by understanding this connection, learners can see that global events are relevant to daily experiences without causing fear, and that English can be used to explain cause and effect, patterns of influence, and measured outcomes in a calm, structured manner.
We also emphasized that diplomacy is a long-term, careful process where dialogue, negotiation, and communication are often more important than immediate results, and observing subtle signs of cooperation or tension teaches critical thinking and analytical reasoning, which are skills that not only improve comprehension of international relations, but also strengthen formal English usage, because learning to describe uncertainty, incremental progress, and professional interactions requires vocabulary, sentence structures, and linking expressions that are essential for advanced listening and reading in educational and professional contexts.
Yes, Adam, and for learners. It is important to remember that ordinary people are connected to these discussions indirectly through predictable markets, energy stability, and cooperative planning. And by connecting these concepts to familiar examples such as neighborhood planning, workplace coordination, or school teamwork, students can practice English in a context that is relatable, understandable, and reassuring, which makes the learning process both effective and enjoyable while reinforcing the language of diplomacy and global news.
In addition, we dedicated a section to key vocabulary, defining words like diplomacy, mediation, dialogue, tension, stability, communication, and cooperation, providing simple example sentences, and encouraging learners to repeat and apply these words in personal and professional contexts, because vocabulary practice is one of the most important tools for comprehension and communication, and by consistently hearing, repeating, and using these words, English learners build confidence, improve fluency, and acquire the skills to describe complex global events calmly, accurately, and neutrally.
Yes, Adam. And as we close today's episode, dear listeners, please remember that learning English through global topics is a gradual process, and that by practicing listening, repeating vocabulary, summarizing ideas, and connecting complex discussions to everyday experiences, you are steadily improving your language skills, comprehension, and confidence. And it is completely normal not to understand every word immediately, because improvement comes with repetition, exposure, and thoughtful reflection, which is exactly the method we encourage at the English Globe.
Finally, I want to remind all listeners that this podcast is created purely for educational purposes and English learning, and it does not aim to promote or criticize any country, leader, or policy. And by focusing on calm, structured explanations, neutral vocabulary, and careful analysis, our goal is to help learners understand international topics, expand their vocabulary, and develop listening skills in a safe and supportive environment, so you can follow world news, participate in discussions, and think critically in English without stress or alarm.
And for our listeners, thank you very much for joining us today. And I warmly encourage you to continue practicing English by listening to global news, repeating key words and sentences, reflecting on the explanations we provided, and sharing your thoughts or questions with us in the comments, because every step you take strengthens your language skills, builds confidence, and allows you to understand the world more clearly, calmly, and professionally, which is the ultimate goal of the English Globe's educational and learner-focused podcast series.
So, dear listeners, with curiosity, practice, and calm reflection, we conclude today's episode on the U.S.-Iran talks in Oman, and we hope that you feel more confident in understanding diplomacy, recognizing key vocabulary, analyzing media reports, and connecting global discussions to everyday life. And by revisiting these explanations, practicing your English, and listening carefully, you will continue to improve your comprehension, communication, and critical thinking skills, which will serve you in both learning English and understanding the world around you.
Yes. And finally, remember that every episode of the English Globe is designed to help you grow, not only in language ability, but also in awareness of global events. And by listening patiently, practicing vocabulary, and reflecting on our discussions, you can develop both your English skills and your understanding of international topics in a calm, safe, and educational way. And we look forward to joining you again in future episodes to continue learning together step by step.